Welcome to Echoes of History, a Ubisoft podcast brought to you by History Hit. This is the place to explore the rich stories from the past that bring the world of Assassin's Creed to life. I'm Matt Lewis. Join me on a trip to the Mediterranean 2,500 years ago. Assassin's Creed Odyssey takes us on an epic journey through ancient Greece during the Peloponnesian Wars, when Sparta and Athens struggled for supremacy. This war had a profound effect on the landscape of Athens, saw the advancement of medicine into a more scientific age, and it was fought in the homeland of the Olympic Games. To reveal all of this and more, I spoke to ancients expert Tristan Hughes about the rich history of the Parthenon, to Dr. Nigel Spivey about what it might be like to be at the ancient Olympic Games, and to Professor Helen about the father of medicine himself, Hippokrates. Let's dive into the echoes of history. So we're here today to talk about the Parthenon, which is a building that is in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. It's a building you can climb and you can run through and you can explore. So just to start us off with a real basic knowledge, because I don't know anything about ancient history, so I'm here to learn. What is the Parthenon and where is it?
The Parthenon is, it's sometimes heralded as the eighth wonder of the world. It's this beautiful ancient Greek temple constructed in the 5th century BC in Athens, arguably the most prominent city-state in the Greek world. And it is, in regards to its architecture and its art, one of the most stunning surviving examples of classical art and architecture from the ancient Greek, arguably the ancient Mediterranean world. So it is absolutely stunning. It is placed atop a large rocky outcrop known as the Acropolis. That became basically the religious heart of classical Athens, and much of Athens is flat. So to have this great rocky outcrop in the centre, it was very much a very visual location for anyone approaching Athens, whether that be from sea or from land. So yes, it has become the symbol of classical art and architecture, I think you could very much argue, and one of the most memorable, one of the most recognisable ancient pieces of architecture surviving from classical Greece. And the classical Greece I'm talking about, the 5th century BC, but also the 4th century BC too.
Yeah, and incredible to think that something from that period that people would have sailed towards Athens in those days and looked at, you can still see and visit today. It's still there and still iconic. I'm going to say it's iconic. Before we get a little bit further into the Parthenon, the idea that this was a temple, this was a religious site, leads me into my complete lack of knowledge, really, of the Greek gods. So is the Parthenon dedicated to one particular god?
Well, the function of the Parthenon is actually a tricky topic, and some have even argued that it wasn't a temple in the slightest because there's no associated priesthood. However, one of our ancient sources who visited the Parthenon, this basically, think of him as an ancient travel writer, a man called Pausanias. When he visits it, he mentions it as a temple, so it almost certainly did have a religious function, but it also had a function as a treasury. But yes, it is named the Parthenon, and after Athena Parthenos, so one of the most recognisable deities of the ancient Greek pantheon of gods. And yeah, so let's kind of go into the pantheon of gods. So ancient Greeks, polytheistic, they worshipped a number of different gods. The most recognisable of them would arguably be the 12 or 13 Olympian deities that are mentioned time and time again. For instance, Zeus, king of the gods, you've got his wife Hera, then you've got likes of Athena, Dionysus, god of wine, he's always a fun one, Ares, Hephaestus, Apollo, Hermes, messenger of the gods, Aphrodite, and quite a few others. And then you get the gods in the underworld, like Hades and Persephone, Demeter too, Artemis. Those are perhaps the biggest deities that you think of ancient Greece. But then they also had a lot of deities that are less mentioned in the literature, the prime example being Hestia, goddess of the hearth. And then there are many other gods and goddesses as well that are brought into the pantheon. Helios, god of the sun, or Selene, goddess of the moon. And then you get lots of mythical creatures associated with the myths of certain gods and goddesses, and then demigods like Heracles too. So, long story short, the Greek pantheon of gods and goddesses is a whole range of different deities ruling over different parts of the world, sometimes overlapping, and they're very complicated figures. They're certainly not good guys, I think is the best way. All of these gods and goddesses have flaws. You don't want to mess with one. You don't want to get on the wrong side of a gods and goddess, or because the vengeance is pretty horrific in many cases.
Just to position Athena then, she sits in that kind of top tier of the Greek gods and goddesses?
Yeah, she's in that 12 and 13 Olympian deities that I mentioned earlier, but I think she is most famously known as the goddess of wisdom. But she's also a virgin goddess, and she's also the goddess of war, goddess of skilled crafts, so weaving. She embodies strategic intelligence, whether, strategy in war, wisdom, but weaving as well. So strategic thinking in all of those things. But she does become a very important goddess, and also a goddess you don't want to cross, not just for the Athenians, but the ancient Greek world.
And so you mentioned, if we get back to the Parthenon, you mentioned that it's built on the Acropolis. Why is that spot chosen for this building?
I think to do this, we'll go back to the beginning of the 5th century BC. So the story of the Parthenon really is the late 5th century BC when it's built. But the origins of the Parthenon, you can go back to one of the big events of classical Greek history, which is the Persian Wars. And I believe Thermopylae is shown at the beginning of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And that, of course, Battle of Thermopylae is part of the Persian Wars. But what happens during the Persian Wars? It's 480 BC. So the Athenians in 490 BC, one of their greatest prided moments is when they defeat the Persian invasion force led by King Darius I at the Battle of Marathon. However, the second Persian invasion of Greece, this is even bigger, and this is by the Persian king Xerxes. And Xerxes, he marches a massive land force and an accompanying navy with ancient Macedonia, defeats the Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. And then what happens is the Persians arrive in force at Athens and they burn the Acropolis to the ground, including all the temples, the architecture on top of the Acropolis. And Athens is burnt by Xerxes. The Athenians do ultimately beat this force, a combined force, at the Battle of Salamis, this famous naval battle, but the city of Athens and the Acropolis was torched. And when the Persians are finally beaten the following year at Plataea, one story is that there is an oath that is taken, the Oath of Plataea, which deems that the ruins of those buildings burned and destroyed by the Persians would not be rebuilt, and that they would be there almost like a lasting memory to make sure that something like that never happened again. What happens there is you see Athens rising to the fore right at the start. So following the defeat of the Persians, there is a league of city-states, including Sparta and Athens and Corinth and many others, that unite in this desire to liberate Greek cities that have been conquered by the Persians and then kind of defeat the Persian threat, because they don't know whether the Persians will come back or not. So there is very much this idea of keeping the fight going, and this league will keep fighting. Sparta leaves that alliance very quickly, and Athens becomes the dominant force, and they form this league called the Delian League after the island of Delos, which is the center of it. And over the next few decades, that league goes from being voluntary, where they're all kind of giving money into the treasury, they're giving ships, they're contributing to this combined force with Athens at its head, into Athens becoming basically the de facto leader of it, being the most powerful, forbidding powers and Greek city-states across the Greek world, particularly the Aegean, to leave. And over time, the Athenians then take direct control of the money. They also, that Oath of Plataea is conveniently discarded around 450 BC. The Athenians have a lot of money. They have the treasury, and then they decide, okay, we're going to get rid of the ruins on the Acropolis, and we're going to build these beautiful new buildings, unlike anything the Greek world has ever seen. Absolutely spectacular, splendorous buildings to really promote the power and magnificence almost the revival of Athens following the sack of the Acropolis by the Persians. And that will kickstart this massive building program on the Acropolis.
What do we know about who constructed it? Do we have any sense of who is in charge of Athens at this time, who is driving this revival in the buildings?
Well, yes, we do. Well, we get one figure who's really associated as the man who kind of kickstarts this whole building program. And in fact, his name is very much associated with it, the Periclean building program. This figure of Pericles, who was a leading Athenian statesman in the mid-5th century BC, right at the forefront of Athenian democratic politics. In the case of Athenian democracy, very different to our democracy, but hey, topic for another day. But he's a prominent statesman for several decades, and he's a big proponent of the Athenian Empire. So by 450 BC, Pericles is a leading figure, and I think he's one of the main influential voices in one of these big actions that's seen as a defining moment in this transformation from that Delian League, that alliance of Greek city-states originally against the Persians, into the Athenian Empire, when he moves that league's treasury from the, albeit quite neutral, island of Delos in the Aegean to Athens. And that treasury will ultimately be placed within the Parthenon. So he's a big proponent of that. And then when they've got hold of the money in Athens, and this, I think it can be said, is one of the biggest examples of embezzlement in ancient history, is that he uses the funds from the Delian League to fund the building of this massive building program in Athens, designed to very much beautify and promote the power and stature of Athens. And one of the buildings central to that, on the Acropolis, is the Parthenon. Using funds from this supposedly Delian League, it's evidently the Athenian Empire by this time. And I'll say again, one of the biggest cases of embezzlement in ancient Greek history.
Incredible to think you could look at the Parthenon now and think that is an example of organised crime in the 5th century BC. Yeah. How are people building something like the Parthenon in ancient Greece? Clearly very well, because it still stands today. But do we have any sense of the kind of building technologies and materials that they're using to achieve that?
The Athenians were meticulous record keepers. So it's quite interesting that in their bureaucracy, we have an idea when the building of the Parthenon starts, which is around 447 BC, from these records. And also we have early mentions of the materials that are gathered for it. What is amazing about the Parthenon is that it's built entirely out of marble. There have been older temples built partly of marble, but never entirely of marble. Even the roof tiles are made of marble, supposedly, for the Parthenon. So it is built entirely of marble, and not just that, like the best marble that the Athenians knew of, because Athens had a great source of marble very close on the Attic Peninsula, which is where Athens is located, Attica. But what's quite interesting in regards to the building techniques, what is also mentioned is a lot of wood being brought to the Parthenon. So that would probably hint at, it's been suggested, scaffolding. Yes, they would have had some sorts of machinery like cranes, iron tools, and very, very good architects.
Do we have an idea, when it's finished, of what the Parthenon would have looked like at its peak, when it's newly built, when it's being opened? Do we have descriptions of it, precisely what it looked like, or can it be reconstructed from what survives today?
We have fleeting mentions of it, what it looked like when it was built from the 5th century BC. But yes, we do, either from reconstructions or mentions of what visitors saw of it throughout history, not just in ancient history, and also with certain parts of it that didn't survive, we don't really get many records of apart from fleeting mentions. Let's say the statue of Athena Parthenos, for whom we have an account by Pausanias a few centuries later, this travel writer, but there are also kind of copies of the statue which have been used to get more idea of the details of that statue. Yes, we have a pretty good idea of its design.
Players in the game can go and explore this temple. I think it'd be really nice to understand, hopefully, how accurate it is when they're walking through it, and what those parts of the buildings were for when you run through them.
Parthenon is an ancient Greek temple, but it's been turned up to 11 because it's built completely out of marble, and it has those hallmarks of ancient Greek temples. But I think the first thing for me to point out is a particular architectural style of Greek temples, which was very prominent in the 6th century BC, so the Archaic period, and this was known as the Doric order, so Doric temple styles. And great examples of that survive. For instance, one of my favourites is in southern Italy, a place called Paestum, ancient Greek Poseidonia, and there are a few ancient Greek temples there which are very much this Doric style, and the Parthenon replicates it, even though it's built when I think the Doric order, I wouldn't say it's fallen out of fashion, but it's seen as quite an old style by them, which might hint that the people who built the Parthenon wanted it to look older than it actually was. What you notice first of all with the Parthenon is this large colonnade. And it is a large colonnade. Each of these columns is a Doric column, so they're these large fluted columns, not much other decoration on them, all completely made of marble. 8 along the width of each end, and then 17 along the length of either side of the colonnade. So I think that's 46 columns around the outside, the exterior. And what is interesting with these columns is you won't really be able to see with the naked eye because it's such a small adjustment, but it shows the real capabilities of these architects, is that they bulge slightly in the middle. It's a thing called entasis, and this is an optical illusion. Because if they were completely straight and you looked at the Parthenon from afar, let's say you're approaching Athens or something, the columns would not look straight. If they were straight, it's really confusing. Don't get me into the details with it. However, if you do that slight illusion by make it bulge slightly in the middle, make it lean slightly inwards, and I think on the end columns at either end are also slightly larger, those little tweaks, tiny tweaks, ensure that when someone sees it from afar, the columns look completely straight. And then above the Doric columns, you have this beautiful sculpture, almost kind of strip cartoon-like sculpture. You see different scenes, mythical scenes around the lengths and width. So each side shows a different kind of mythological scene, would have probably been painted, and we know that they may have had bronze armor on as well. And divided them up, you have these 3 vertical lines between each of these little kind of snippets. And they're called triglyphs. And that's very iconic of Doric temples too.
What kind of stories do they tell us? Can you give us an example of one of the images that we can see there?
So on one side, you have the Trojan War. So think Achilles and Hector, Agamemnon, Menelaus. So Greeks versus Trojans. Then you have something called a Centauromachy, which is showing 2 mythological creatures, centaurs and lapiths. The centaurs have been invited to a wedding of the lapiths, and the centaurs have a bit too much to drink, and they start trying to seize the lapith women and start fighting and brawling, and you see the lapiths resisting and fighting against them, and the women fighting too. Then the next one, you have a Titanomachy, the fight of the Titans, so the Olympian gods versus the Titans, kind of once again the battle of the heavens. And the final one, if I remember correctly, is a Amazonomachy, which is a battle with the Amazons, Greeks fighting Amazons. So those are the 4 different mythological scenes represented in these metopes, the strip cartoons like on each side, each of the 4 sides. Within that kind of Doric exterior is you get Ionic elements, which are more kind of, the Parthenon mixes these 2 architectural orders together. An Ionic order is defined by these different styles of columns, which I don't think you see on the Parthenon, but rather than having those metopes and triglyphs that I mentioned earlier, instead it has a continuous frieze all around it. And what you have further in on the Parthenon is you have this continuous frieze, and part of that you can see in the British Museum, and a significant part you can also see at the Acropolis Museum in Athens. And there's a debate about what it shows, but I believe it does show the Panathenaic procession, this important procession that ended up on the Acropolis and was once every 4 years, this great festival to Athena. Going on from that, in the interior of the Parthenon, there were 2 different rooms, but the main room housed this beautiful statue, 12 meters tall, of Athena Parthenos, and we don't have that surviving, which we'll get to in a moment, but Pausanias describes part of it, and we can understand more of it from copies of it from Roman times, and it shows Athena standing upright with her classic objects like the helmet, an aegis, breastplate, spear, shield. There's a depiction of a snake, which is believed to be a legendary early king of Athens who was born from the ground and was adopted by Athena, and there was a big pool of water in front to keep the ivory okay. So that ivory and gold statue is there, beautiful statue, adorned with decoration and different scenes. I think there's Greeks fighting Amazons, there's a depiction of Pandora, the first woman as well. The last thing I will say about the decoration is the 2 pediments right on top. Now the pediments are the triangular bit right on top of the Parthenon. One side shows the birth of Athena. The other one shows the mythical story of how Athena becomes the patron deity of Athens.
What do we know about the kind of people who used it? So if this is a temple, but it's also a treasury, do we have a sense of the kind of people who were milling around there all day? Was it a place of business, a place of worship, a bit of both?
Place of worship, absolutely. This is still like the religious heart of Athens. So you would still imagine priests and priestesses being in this area, but also guards. This is a treasury at the end of the day. This was where the money was. And of course, you've got this great gold and ivory statue of Athena Parthenos within, 12 meters high, this statue. So there will be guards patrolling the outside of the building. Now, I don't know much else about other people being able to mill about, but those are two types of people that you should think about when you're thinking about the 5th century Acropolis.
And what do we know about what happens to the Parthenon as the classical world begins to fade, I guess?
As time goes on, so the Athenian Empire comes crumbling down at the end of the war called the Peloponnesian War, and this kind of height of Athens as an imperial power over the next century fades. But the Parthenon is still there. The Parthenon is still this shining beacon, this beautiful temple. And you see warlords in that Hellenistic period, that rise following the death of Alexander the Great, and fight over his empire. Warlords fight over Athens and the Acropolis. But then, over time, the Parthenon is kind of robbed of the gold of the statue of Athena Polias. There's like civil wars of Athens. Then the Romans come a bit later. Sulla, there's a great sack of Athens. And I think a lot of the treasures of Athens are sacked then, brought to Rome, taken away from the Acropolis, including from the Parthenon. You then get a massive sack of Athens in the 3rd century by a Germanic people called the Heruli, which is probably when the Parthenon there's a massive fire of the Parthenon and the statue is destroyed. So that's when the statue of Athena Parthenos is gone. And then you get a bit later the emergence of Christianity. So Christianity becomes the state religion, Theodosius at the end of the 4th century. And around that time, you see a lot of pagan Greek religion, Roman religion buildings associated with deities either destroyed, or if they're fortunate, they are transformed into churches. And some of the best preserved buildings we have from antiquity are those which continue to be used because they're transformed into churches. And the Parthenon is another example. It's converted into the Church of the Virgin Mary. So there you go. One virgin divine figure to another virgin divine figure, from Athena to Mary. There is some consequences for this in the fact that many of the mythological scenes on the Parthenon that we've mentioned earlier are defaced because, it doesn't suit with Christian beliefs. I think some of them, however, aren't. I think one of the pediments is defaced. I believe it is the Athena versus Poseidon contest, but I might be wrong on that one. And it remains a church for several centuries until Athens is conquered by the Ottoman Turks, and it goes from church into a mosque until you get to the 17th century and a siege of Athens by the Venetians. I think it's September 1687, when the Venetians, they're attacking Athens and they're bombarding Athens. I think it's by ship. And the Ottomans store their gunpowder in the Parthenon, thinking that the Venetians wouldn't strike it. They do. And the gunpowder store explodes, and a lot of the Parthenon is exploded. And so, you get parts of the Parthenon falling off. Some parts of that are then taken by Lord Elgin, and that's why some of the Parthenon marbles, also sometimes known as the Elgin marbles, have ended up controversially at the British Museum today. We must mention that. Since then, it's a place that lots of people go and visit. But I've very much glossed over the whole legacy. I've kind of talked about some of the big events. The legacy of the Parthenon is absolutely a podcast episode in its own right.
Yeah, it's incredible to think it's a 2,500-year-old building, but it's still alive today. It still has a role. It's still the centre of lots of study and rebuilding and everything else. It's been a focus for Athens' religious life and its social life, and it still is today. People go to Athens to visit the Parthenon, to be connected to that 2,500 years of history there. You can listen to the full interview exploring every nook and cranny of the Parthenon by clicking on the link in the description to listen to the Echoes of History podcast. Or you can follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome to Echoes of History, Helen. Fantastic to have you here.
Lovely to be asked.
I'm very much looking forward to finding out more about Hippokrates. I vaguely know the name. As a medieval historian, I know nothing about the man, so I'm fascinated to find out more. The first thing I wanted to ask you was maybe a technical point. So in the game, Hippokrates is spelt with a K, but more often I see it spelt with a C. Is there a reason for that difference?
Yeah, so the original would be a K. So the Greek letter is a kappa, it's a K, and it's pronounced the K hard sound, and they don't really have a C. So Ks come out as Cs when you sort of Latinize it, and then when you put it into other European languages. Having it with a K is kind of posh. It's like saying, "Ooh, I'm really Greek." It's the classy way to do it.
There you go, Ubisoft being classy with a K. And I guess most people will know the name Hippocrates. They may know of the Hippocratic Oath. Famously, doctors swear to do no harm to anybody else. But what do we actually know about Hippocrates, the man? Do we know kind of roughly when he's born? What do we know about his life?
Oh, we're talking big void here. I mean, just for starters, the Hippocrates wrote the oath thing. There's an oath, it's in ancient Greek. It comes from maybe the time when Hippocrates is supposed to have lived, which is about 460 to 370 BC. But whether there's any connection between the two, the man, the text, really don't know. The reason why we've got those dates, 460 to 370, is because there are a couple of references to Hippocrates in the philosopher Plato. Plato just sort of drops the name like, you all know who Hippocrates is. He taught medicine for a fee. That's one of the things he says. And he believed that to understand the whole, you need to understand the parts, or to understand the parts, you need to understand the whole, whatever that means. And that's it. But those dialogues of Plato are set in that period, sort of from 460 onwards. So one's set in 433-ish, that's Plato's Protagoras, and that would make probably Hippocrates in his 20s at that point. So famous enough to be known to people. And then the other one's set a few years later than that. So suggesting that everyone just knows the name. They might not know anything about him, but they know the name, Hippocrates. So the name has always been very famous since Plato mentions him.
It sounds like he lived to a ripe old age as well. If he thought to have been around between those dates, we're getting into old age by the time he potentially passed away.
Yeah, we are. And if you look at the history of people writing the biography of Hippocrates, which is something that's based on absolutely no facts, it's just, let's write a biography of a doctor. What would he be like? Where would he have worked? What would he have done? Using the Hippocratic texts. So if they mention a particular town, you can say, oh, Hippocrates obviously went there. But that's making the assumption that text is actually about the real Hippocrates. There's lots of assumptions going on. So you can sort of put together places and events and things and suggest that that's his life. But people who do that also have to speculate on his age. And you've got people who say he lived till he was 95. You've got people who say he lived till he was over 100. Because obviously, if he's the best doctor in the human race, he's got to have been quite long-lived, hasn't he?
Yeah, physician heal thyself and all of that kind of thing. What are our main sources then for where we think we're getting close to Hippocrates? You mentioned Plato then. Who else is writing about him, and how certain can we be that they're actually talking about Hippocrates?
Well, it sounds promising because they're talking about a doctor, definitely, in Plato. It's someone who taught medicine for a fee, so we know it's a doctor. And we've also got Aristotle, similar sort of date, writing that Hippocrates was great in name but not in stature, suggesting that people sort of knew what he looked like. He wasn't that big a guy. But that's it really for contemporary sources. So what you have is mostly the actual texts of ancient Greek medicine, assumed all to have been written by Hippocrates. So incidentally, that would probably cover about 200 years. So if he did live that long, he really was doing well. But they have different slants on them. So some of them are quite conversational. Some of them are lists of facts, things you need to look for in a patient. And some of them are quite theoretical. Some of them are lists of remedies, lots of different types of thing, and different styles, and also different theories. That's rather worrying, isn't it? So Hippocrates changed his mind on a daily basis. There isn't a Hippocratic theory of medicine. There's a sort of general thing about observation, empirical evidence, being with patients, seeing what they feel like. There's even a description of someone dying where they talk about touching the feet to sort of see if they're cold or not. This is someone who's quite hands-on, or if it's not one person, it's lots of people who are hands-on with patients. But in terms of actual factual stuff, like he was born in this place, he died there, there really isn't anything. It's all based on later conjectures, particularly when people want to have Hippocrates associated with their hometown. So you tell a story about him being there because it sounds good, doesn't it?
And we also have this collection of writing which is attributed to Hippocrates. Is there a sense that there's a period where medicine is developing and evolving, and what everyone is doing is conflating what's going on into this one single figure for convenience, maybe?
I think that's a really good way of looking at it. There is something going on in sort of science generally in that period, sort of late 5th century into the 4th century. An interest in observing the world, as I say, and seeing what's happening, and trying to get rules from that, trying to look at examples and then come up with a rule that covers all those examples. And you get that sense very clearly in the Hippocratic writings that they're accumulating individual cases, things they've seen and then trying to come to some sort of conclusion. Why does that always happen? So I think there is a genuine sort of scientific revolution going on in this period, and these texts are part of that, whoever wrote them.
And so is there a sense that potentially Hippocrates may not have been responsible for all of these things, but he's the most famous person, so all of this is hung around him a little bit? Why is he the name that we remember?
Well, it's because he's in Plato. So Plato, everybody knows Plato. Plato's been used in schools for years and years. He was part of the education system through many, many centuries. So because he's in Plato, he's therefore got the reality factor. But the actual texts, there's still nothing to identify any one of them as by Hippocrates. None of them are signed. And there's a theory, which is a really good theory, that it's all to do with a librarian at the Great Library of Alexandria who would have accumulated all these various medical texts. According to the stories about it, they would confiscate books from anyone arriving at the port in Egypt, and they copy them and then give back the copies and keep the originals. So they could have been building up these texts, and whenever the librarian got another medical one, it's like, oh, medicine, it's got to be Hippocrates, hasn't it? So you file it under Hippocrates, and then you end up with this huge amount of stuff being under Hippocrates. So Hippocrates gets even more great because he wrote all this stuff, but he didn't.
I mean, I'm sure he'd be very pleased to learn that he's been credited with all of this kind of thing, though, even if it's by accident. We also have this popular image when we think of what Hippocrates might have looked like, this kindly, wise old man with a big long beard. I mean, not dissimilar, I guess, to Christian ideals of God. You know, he's that fatherly figure. Do we have any idea what he might have looked like, how close that could have been? No idea at all. It's the dominant image, and certainly it fits with what you want Hippocrates to be, and a lot of this is about what you want him to be. In other words, the visual image of Hippocrates is reflecting what people think the texts are saying about what a doctor should be, the ideal doctor. So yes, he is like God, or Santa Claus without the hat. But there's also some very weird things going on there. So there's this thing about his baldness, which does feature in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Don't mention the baldness. He's bald. Now, is that a good thing in a doctor? Wouldn't you think a doctor might have a surefire remedy for baldness? So throughout the history of looking at Hippocrates, so 2,000 years plus, people have said, well, he was bald, but he did try to cure it, and he had this remedy for baldness. And you will find this remedy on the internet today. It's being used to say, look, this is Hippocrates' recipe for baldness. It didn't work. But Helen's amazing baldness remedy will do the thing Hippocrates didn't. So it's like the one thing he couldn't do, this one failure, was to cure his own baldness. And the remedy is fab, if you like a good ancient remedy. So I'm in need of a good baldness remedy, so I've got my pen.
I think you're at an early stage there, but you never know. You might need this. So it's pigeon droppings, cumin, so nice sort of herby, spicy thing, and some nettles, stinging nettles, maybe rose petals. And this recipe turns up again and again through the history of looking at Hippocrates. But what I find fascinating is it actually does come from a real Hippocratic text, but it's not a recipe for male pattern baldness. It comes from one of the gynecological texts. So it's really not aimed at men at all. And somehow that became Hippocrates' remedy for hair loss that he used himself.
What were the kinds of things that whoever this group of people that we're going to call Hippocrates were preaching? What was it and how was it different from what was otherwise about at the time? It
was very much based on natural causes, not on religion. That's not to say that Hippocrates and the Hippocratic corpus or whatever rejected the gods. They didn't. The treatise on the sacred disease talks specifically about how something which we identify as probably epilepsy was not due to the gods choosing someone to strike down, but was due to totally natural causes, in this case, phlegm, sort of cold fluid in the head that was somehow getting stuck. So there's very much the idea that the body is responsible. You don't need to look outside the body. And then that means that you can treat the body without having to go outside the body. So you don't need to involve religion. That's not to say that religion wasn't still there. Hippocratic medicine exists alongside the temples of the healing god Asclepius and other gods and goddesses who had a healing function for particular parts of the body. But you didn't need to do that. You just needed to balance your body. I think balance is a very important word. Hippocratic medicine talks a lot about fluids in the body, which are sort of swooshing around. And you need to make sure that you don't have too much of one fluid and not enough of another. And you can adjust your fluids by your diet, which is actually a broader word in Greek than it is in our English language. It means not just food and drink, but also exercise, your sleeping patterns, and so on. So the whole health thing. So you can rebalance your body with the aid of a doctor who can tell you what you're doing wrong. So doctors are sort of like personal trainers. They don't just give you a remedy, because this is obviously pre-antibiotics, pre-anything like that. They give you a program of diet and exercise and so on, lifestyle changes.
It sounds an awful lot like a lot of things you might hear on the internet today when people talk about, if you just make this simple lifestyle change, everything will be a lot better. Most of us would probably frown at things like that. I wonder whether Hippocrates and his fellows were getting a similar reaction then, that, they're a bunch of quacks who are coming up with these weird ideas about medicine.
Yeah, the bunch of quacks thing is fascinating, because obviously you always want to be the person who's calling someone else a quack, don't you? And Hippocrates certainly do that. They talk about people who come along with daft theories in their view, like, don't go to bed with your left leg on top of your right leg or something like that, and don't sleep with a goat's skin on top of you and you'll be okay. And I think it's quite possible that they would have been seen as just as daft as that. But, of course, they're generally not going for a sort of one-size-fits-all medicine. It's much more personalised. Again, that's quite modern, isn't it? Personalised medicine. It makes it difficult when certain things happen, though. So, of course, the big problem here is something like an epidemic disease, where everyone gets the same disease. And then you can't say, well, it's because of your individual balance and so on. And that was always a problem. Hippocratic medicine would not have been good on COVID.
Yeah, it still confounded even this new thinking. And I guess with my medievalist head on, I would suggest or understand that Hippocratic idea of particularly the four humours, so blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, it survives for a surprising amount of time. For something that we would today recognise as not true, it becomes the basis of medicine for a couple of millennia.
Yes, that's a fair comment. So that's mostly because of Galen. So Galen, the great Roman Empire doctor, 2nd century AD, doctor to the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius and the royal family, and the most prolific writer of antiquity. I mean, he just wrote pages every day of his life. Galen saw himself as a sort of new version of Hippocrates 600 years on. And Galen looked at the Hippocratic corpus and was very aware that it didn't really match up. You couldn't say one person had written all of this. So he picked the bits he liked the best and said, those are the genuine ones Hippocrates wrote. And one of those was a treatise called On the Nature of Man. And there's a section of that which Galen said was genuine, real Hippocrates. Other bits of it he thought were a bit fake. But the bit he liked was the bit with the four humours. So that's why it becomes the really dominant part of Hippocratic medicine that goes on, as you say, for centuries and centuries, for millennia. So other theories in the Hippocratic corpus about disease, like it's all to do with the balance of fire and water in the body, they went out the window, and it all was four humours. So Hippocratic medicine is about more than four humours, but at the same time, that is one of the theories that was around, and it's because of Galen, it becomes the Hippocratic theory. Because we all want to have Hippocrates on our team, don't we?
I'm just imagining Galen sitting there with his red pen going through everything. It's like, nope. Oh, we'll keep that. That'll be Hippocrates. Almost unilaterally deciding the course of Western medicine for 1,000 odd years after himself.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair comment. And he tried all sorts of other little theories along the way. So if you had a bit of Hippocratic writing that looked okay, but not as good as the bits he wanted to be genuine, you could say, well, that's Hippocrates' grandson or something writing that. And then you had Hippocrates' dodgy son-in-law. So anything you didn't like, that's his dodgy son-in-law trying to get into the family business and writing his own really bad medical texts. So all sorts of ways of dividing up this mass of texts in order to get what you want.
I like that. Hippocrates Jr. and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, a very strange way of addressing it.
They did repeat their names, grandsons were often named after their grandfathers, so it's by Hippocrates, which one?
Just thinking back to the time of Hippocrates a little bit, and obviously in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, people encounter Hippocrates and they deal with this huge figure who is viewed as the father of medicine. But do we have a sense of what operating as a doctor might have been like during this period, during the Peloponnesian War period? Are we talking about people who sit in a surgery, as we would expect a doctor to now, or are they travelling with armies, or both?
This period, they're mostly travelling. The texts called the Epidemics, which is 7 different volumes of epidemics, some of which are more associated with the real Hippocrates than others historically, like the good ones. These describe doctors wandering around the Greek world. You turn up in a town, you say, hello, I'm a doctor. People bring out their patients. You treat them. Word gets around. More people bring out their patients. Someone drops dead. You leave town rather rapidly. It can be like that. Armies could have doctors with them. In the Roman period, there were also doctor surgeries in some towns. Some places would pay for a doctor to set up there because they thought doctors were so important. But the way he turns up in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, he's sort of being called out and doing various different things. I think that's quite accurate for how a doctor would be in that period.
I mean, you've written a book as well called Hippocrates Now.
Bizarrely, I have a copy just here.
And I think you mentioned that that's available kind of open access as well, so anyone can get a copy of that if they want to.
Yes, anyone can read it. It's through Bloomsbury Publishing is the company, and Bloomsbury have something called Knowledge Unlatched, KU, and you can get it through Knowledge Unlatched. You can read the whole thing online, no registration required. Just go for it. Because I thought I'd like this book to be out there so that people from different viewpoints could think, hang on, I've just read something online which says Hippocrates said walking is the best medicine. Did he say that? No. So this is where I can actually analyse it in some detail. So
that sounds like a great resource for people to go and learn a whole load more about this topic than we're able to cover here. And obviously very generous to make that available for free as well. In terms of Hippocrates now, what would you consider to be the legacy or the legacies of Hippocrates? If we've spoken a little bit about a man who is probably a bucket for lots of different people's thinking and writing and teaching, and even what he looks like is kind of an amalgamation of an ideal doctor, and particularly lots of his teachings around the 4 humours and things like that are now disproved. Does he have a legacy today?
He has a legacy because of being the first. There's something about being the father of medicine, a title which he gets pretty early on. Only one father for medicine. So everybody, whether that's orthodox mainstream medicine or various alternative medicines, has seen the need over history to claim him as their ancestor too. Everyone wants to be in the Hippocrates family. It's like this is where real medicine is. It's an extraordinary legacy to have. And it's had an effect on ethics as well. So the sorts of questions that come up in Hippocratic texts, and indeed in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, like, do you treat your enemies, for example? Or do you say, ooh, that's my enemy, they can die? Do you treat bad people? Those are real medical, ethical questions.
Yeah, we're claiming some sort of authority from this Father Christmas figure 2,500 years ago for kind of live debates that are happening today. And there is always that danger of interpretation, isn't there? Because it's a question of, does Hippocrates say don't do this, or does he say don't do it this way? Actually, you can do it, just don't do it this way.
Yeah, exactly. So it's always fraught and it's always open to debate. Saying Hippocrates says doesn't actually close down debates, strangely. It leaves them open. So when people say, oh, well, but Hippocrates said ... they're doing it as if it closes the debate down. But because of the range of texts and the fact we don't know what he wrote anyway, it can never close it down completely.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Nigel. Welcome to Echoes of History.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. I guess to start off with, what do we mean when we talk about the ancient Olympics? Because I guess what we think about today, we call the modern Olympics. What's the difference between the two, apart from time, I guess?
Oh, that's a big question to start with. I mean, when we talk about the ancient Olympics, we are essentially referring to the continuous and institutionalized meeting of athletes that took place at this place Olympia in the Peloponnese area of Greece from the notional start date of 776 BCE up until closure under one of the Byzantine emperors around about 400 AD or CE. And that's a continuum. But if you ask, how do we know that absolute date of start? The answer is we just have to take the word of the ancient Greeks, and they didn't have, of course, the chronology that we're calling BC. But for them, it was the beginning of history. So they start counting their absolute dates in history from the first Olympiad.
Fascinating that it was obviously considered so important that they literally date the beginning of time from the first Olympiad. So how then did the Olympics emerge? There's lots of kind of myths and legends about how they came into being, and some of those involve the Greek gods. Do we have any real sense of what some of those myths are, but how close to reality any of them might be?
I mean, I think we tend to have a mindset that is distrustful of the fabulous, the mythological. So in that case, we have to sort of think ourselves into a more credulous mentality about these things. But of course, the big difference between the Greeks and us in terms of how we have approached Olympia is that since around the last quarter of the 19th century, we have been trying to dig for the evidence of how the Olympics started, amongst other things. So we think we have a story that we can match against the mythology. So mythology, for example, tells you that how do you get the length of the stadium? It was paced out by Heracles. And that's a picturesque way of thinking about it. Of course, the archaeologists are more skeptical. And I mean, I think archaeology of Olympia, which is ongoing, by the way. But they've established, I think, pretty convincingly that people were meeting at this site in the Peloponnese before the Olympics got going as an official festival, and that some kind of religious worship was happening there, probably associated with that. You know, some have supposed that what this means is that people are getting together on a kind of regular annual basis to do horse trading, to show off their livestock and such like. And that then you can imagine how that would develop into, you know, my horse is faster than yours, let's put it to the test. And you start to create these competitions. So I think some kind of contest going on that involved tests of strength and speed in a place that is numinous. I think even, you know, in the age of mass tourism, people sense at Olympia, it's got quite a dramatic microclimate. There are lots of thunderstorms. It gets very humid. And when you hear a clap of thunder, you know, Zeus rumbling, gathering the clouds. You can imagine how it sort of picked up in the Bronze Age, this sense that...
Yeah, so you're almost in a spot where you're a bit closer to the gods.
There was a burial mound there, a tumulus. Now, the Greeks would not have thought of excavating it because, in a sense, they recognized its power as a burial place, and it would have been a sort of sacrilege. But one can imagine them making offerings around this tumulus to the hero, and they thought the hero who was buried there was someone that they called Pelops.
Does Pelops give his name to the Peloponnese region? Is that why we call it that?
Eventually, yes.
Are they trying to emulate what they've heard of the gods and the superheroes doing?
The nearest thing that a mortal could do in terms of aspiring to be immortal, to be a god, was to try and approximate to the potency of these gods. And of course, because the gods were anthropomorphically conceived, so Zeus is just like a very powerful old man, but he is, as we would say, he's ripped. And he never ages, of course, because he's a god. Think of Apollo. The image of Apollo is basically the image of the perfect Greek athlete. But some mortals could sort of become interstitial. So, you know, that boundary between the mortal and the immortal, you could sort of ascend some notches towards immortality. And what kind of immortality was it? Well, you might have a statue erected in your honor that you hoped being made of bronze or marble. You know, it might stay in that place forever. It didn't, but that's another story. Or someone might write a poem about you, and that would become studied as a classic. Well, that has happened.
Fascinating. And you mentioned that there's lots of archaeology going on there. Could you give us a sense of what that place might have looked like during this period?
We've got a pretty good idea of how Olympia developed as a site. I think the first thing to say is that we have to rid ourselves of the notion that once upon a time it was an idyllic experience to go to Olympia. The opposite is true. Slaves in the Roman world could be threatened by their masters. If you don't behave, I'm going to send you to the Olympics, because it required quite a lot of stamina and commitment from the spectators, not to mention the athletes. And in the earliest instantiation, there were no facilities really for the athletes. There was space to compete in, but they had to just, you know, either sleep rough or bring their own tents. The water supplies were not great. And to cap it, they held the festival in August, September. which is a time you don't really want to be in that part of the Peloponnese. Or if you do, you want to be by the seaside. And it's humid, there are these thunderstorms. Eventually the site gets malarial, so mosquitoes are around, the rivers were silting up in late antiquity. So it wasn't a particularly pleasant experience. There must have been a lot of dysentery in the site and such like. So you had to be pretty tough just to be present at the thing. And of course, the more it attracted athletes and spectators and participants, the more money came into the sanctuary. And the local managers of the sanctuary were very adroit at, as it were, giving extra reasons for pilgrimage, to make a pilgrimage to Olympia. Well, from the 5th century onwards, you could see probably the most spectacular sculpture to be seen in that part of the ancient world, which is the chryselephantine image of Zeus, which chryselephantine means it's a lot of ivory, a lot of gold, created by Phidias, who's also associated with the Parthenon. You could go and see that in the temple. And if that wasn't enough, you just had a kind of forest of statues of these successful athletes. Now, this is what has been a bit sort of a disappointment about the archaeology, in the sense that back in the 18th century, antiquarians could dream of finding this place Olympia and all the treasures that would come to light, because they read descriptions of how many very successful athletes had been commemorated with statues and memorials there. But most of them were in bronze, and a lot of those bronzes were destroyed. And so the archaeologists have come up with a rather pathetic, but I think rather moving set of detritus. Eyelids, toenails, noses, just bits and pieces, tantalizing bits and pieces of this array of heroes that was on display. It must have been quite hard to actually walk through the sanctuary because it was so clustered.
Do we have any sense when the Olympics are taking place in the ancient world? Do they last for a fixed period? So do we have a kind of 2-week Olympics like we might recognise today, or is it a longer or shorter festival than that?
It's surprisingly brief as a festival. I think 5 days is usually reckoned to be the extent. And they didn't have what one might call newfangled sports coming in. No team sports really, apart possibly from a relay race. I can't remember if that was in the program as well. But Olympia was part of a circuit of festivals. So although it happened only once every 4 years and it was relatively brief as a meeting, if you were a successful athlete, you could do Olympia, and then you could go on to Athens or Nemea, or as the Romans expand this whole kind of world of athletics, you could go over to Asia Minor or to the Bay of Naples, and you could travel around the Mediterranean. And eventually there were professional athletes who did this. But Olympia was always the big crown to win. And they boasted about that. You see this where even if they win somewhere else, they say, I won at Olympia. Because that was the ultimate test.
That was the gold mark that they wanted.
Yeah, and you didn't really get no-hopers turning up. It's part of the ancient Olympic tradition that when the Romans, as it were, take it over, so the Romans conquered Greece pretty much by the 2nd century BCE, and they sponsor the games. They share the same credence. For them, it's Jupiter, not Zeus, but it's essentially the same. And of course, Roman citizenship being enlarged progressively means that by the 2nd century CE, so let's say the time of the Emperor Hadrian, you've got athletes coming to Olympia from North Africa, from Asia Minor, the Black Sea, and such like, and they're successful.
What do we know about the events that took place? You mentioned that they didn't tend to bring in lots of new events. So was it a fairly settled programme? And do we know what those events were?
Yeah, we got a good idea of what the programme consisted of. Some of the events, in a sense, would, I think, strike us as not particularly akin to modern athletics. So, the chariot racing was a big deal. And that's almost like having Formula One at the modern Olympics. It was very fast and very dangerous, but very spectacular. I think in terms of producing, these mortals who became heroes, the sprint racing, so that would be the sort of equivalent of our 100 meters. And then you would name the games by the winner of that dash. But the program otherwise was, it was combat sports, wrestling, boxing. The pentathlon, I think, was probably the one that comes to mind most of all when we think of the ancient Olympics, because that comprised, these 5 different tests of throwing, jumping, running, and wrestling or boxing. I can't remember now. but it tested your kind of all-round ability as an athlete. And I think probably, if we have a stereotypical view of what does an ancient Greek athlete look like, in terms of the ones that have commemorated as the sort of classical body of that six-pack and the arrangement of muscles in a body, I think the pentathlete is the one who most answers that kind of all-round athleticism. But there were no long-distance races. There was no marathon, and people are surprised at that because the marathon sounds like it's going to be something to do with ancient Greece, and it has got something to do with ancient Greece, but they didn't have long distance races because one of the professions in ancient Greece was that you could be a runner taking messages, and that was a rather servile thing to do.
Forgive me if I'm displaying some ignorance here, but did the athletes compete naked? That's something I've heard plenty of times.
Yeah, there was a tradition that the Greeks recognized as being a weird tradition, that they did compete naked. And whether that continued with the Roman control of the site is still debated. There are pros and cons, I think, to competing in various events without any clothes on. But as usual, they concocted a story about how they were running in loincloths. One of the athletes lost his loincloth and he won, so maybe there was less sort of air resistance or something. Anyway, but they were aware that it was a weird cultural habit and that not everyone was happy with this. But I think you can extend that consideration by remembering that our word gymnasia relates to a Greek word gymnos, which means a state of nudity. So when you go to work out, you should take all your clothes off. But it also has the association that you've got no weapons. One of the explanations is that the Greeks recognized that humans were innately aggressive and had a sort of sense that this was a drive discharge and that they were getting a kind of aggression out of the system in a sort of cathartic way, purging themselves of it, or at least expressing it in a way that it does do some damage. The boxing was done with things that were more like knuckle dusters than protective gloves, and plenty of bones got broken, no doubt, in wrestling as well. But they weren't carrying knives, they weren't carrying weapons, and I think the nudity was that kind of statement, look, this is just me. And it probably also was a way of assimilating to the deities. The deities don't really need clothes either. So if you're going to be a hero, get everything out on display and forget any inhibitions.
That makes me wonder, the idea that they wanted to display that they weren't armed or anything like that. Were there any rules or punishments around cheating? So, modern Olympics today will have routine drug testing and things like that, and people get banned. Were there cases that we know of people cheating in the Olympics?
But actually, one of the things that's been revealed by the archaeologists is that the excavation of the stadium includes the revelation of the sort of tunnel going from the temple sanctuary through to the stadium. And as you approach that tunnel, you go past a series of statue bases. Now, these statues are no longer there, but the bases make it quite clear that these actually commemorate athletes who were caught cheating and who were punished. And it was like a cautionary thing. You run the gauntlet of the villains. So they're heroes in the sanctuary, but they're also the villains, the ones who resorted to underhand strategies to get their victory.
It's fascinating that you were aiming to be immortalised for your achievements, but the flip side of that, the punishment was to be immortalised as a cheat, so that everyone would then know forever that you were a cheat.
And I think there was a sense that, Zeus, he could see what was going on. So, it was a sacrilegious thing too. Having said that, within the bounds of fair play, and I'm not sure there is an ancient Greek term for fair play. I think it's that has come in a post-antique world. But there was quite a lot of latitude for what you could do. There was a thing called the Pancration, which literally means all in fighting. And I don't think you weren't supposed to bite people. Pretty much anything else went. And I imagine that, the real bruisers were to be seen amongst the Pancratiasts, and you wouldn't have wanted to meet them, as they say, on a dark night.
Battle Royale at the Olympics. Did women take part in events at the Olympics?
So there was a festival, there's attestations of a festival, appropriate enough, in honour of the wife of Zeus, Hera. And it seems like there was a festival for women separately, but not on the same scale. And women were not supposed to be spectators. There are stories of one or two coming in disguised. They could sponsor a chariot. They didn't have to ride the chariot themselves, but they could actually be part of the training. So there is a record of a woman, I think, from Sparta, who is considered to be a winner of the chariot race, even though she's not actually holding the reins.
Yeah, fascinating. But does it have kind of wider implications for society and culture in ancient Greece too?
There are those historians of sports who would say that what is going on with the Olympics and these other athletic festivals in this world, in terms of their formation, is, it is also in tandem with democracy, where, you enter a contest knowing that there is a possibility of defeat. It's not sort of, and I'm not saying that there's a kind of, very fixed alignment between that, because obviously, things change under the Romans, and in 776, democracy is yet to be invented. But this kind of development of combative rhetoric and a sense of what is at stake here. I could win, I could lose. What can I prove of myself? I think that does transfer across from the world of Greek politics into athletics.
We've talked a lot about the athletes and the participants and the events they took place in. How much, if anything, do we know about the spectators? Was this the elite, or was this a working man's event to go and see?
What were the spectators like? I guess each athlete would have brought along family, supporters, possibly people who'd been involved in training. So imagine a Greek city-state. If it's a city that's worth the name of city, it will have a gymnasium, or it will have several gymnasia. And this is where you breed your athletes. That's where they do their training. And so those athletes would come to Olympia with, not their managers, but their supporters within a sort of family and friend set. By the same token, of course, they've got to have time to train. And so I think this discussion of ancient Greek sport would not be complete without mentioning that it's a slave economy. And the citizens have slaves who do the hard work, largely speaking, the boring work, the tedious work. But it does mean, the citizens have got to keep themselves ready for battle. So they've got to be fit. As Socrates liked to say, why do you want to run fast? Because you might have to run fast away from the enemy. But there's that obligation. But they do have time to spend training. So they can be full-time athletes, really, for a certain period. So in that sense, the spectators are coming along really as part of the sort of almost like a civic delegation. Pilgrims as well to the site, because they want to see not just their athletes competing, but they just want this experience of being at this amazing place. So yeah, how much spectator involvement, I think, is open to the imagination. But yeah, let's not forget, it was not easy to be a spectator. You had to put up with the Peloponnese in particularly hot and humid time of the year. The question about how the Olympics end is, in a sense, quite simple to answer. It's not so much that as the Roman Empire became Christian, there was a particular Christian disapproval of the practice of athletics as such. And in fact, quite a lot of studies done about how in the writings of Paul, he's using the metaphor of athletics to describe the experience of becoming a Christian, a good Christian. It's more the practice of animal sacrifice, which of course was a hugely important, if not the most important element of being at Olympia, was to worship Zeus. The big celebration at the end of the festival was animal sacrifice on a very large scale. So you just have to imagine an enormous barbecue for all the athletes and their supporters. The bits that get given to the gods of the sacrifice are the bones and the offal and the bits that nobody wants to eat. And over time, a sort of great mountain of this offal built up at Olympia, or burnt remains of. So it must have been very smelly and hugely sort of attractive to flies, and added to the general challenge, I think, of being at Olympia. And that's what specifically antagonized the Christian emperors in Byzantium when the Roman Empire had shifted eastwards, start to do their thing.
And is it a site that the public can visit today? Could we go and walk amongst these statue bases and imagine what it looked like a couple of thousand years ago?
Oh, look, Olympia, every time I've been there, it struck me how irresistible it is. To old and young alike, actually, you're in the stadium. And there's always someone having a run up and down the length of it, despite whatever guards might do to inhibit them. But there's a museum, an excellent museum, with such sculptures as have been retrieved. And the ones from the temple are pretty spectacular. It should be the object of pilgrimage for anyone interested in the genesis of sport.
Thanks for watching Echoes of History. If you've enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the real history behind the Assassin's Creed games, then subscribe for more episodes. You can check out the extended interviews wherever you get your podcasts by clicking on the link in the description. And you should probably also click one of the links that's somewhere on the screen for more fantastic History Hit videos. Do it, wherever they are, do it!